very long and varied history. Right now, he is a professor of computer science and integrated biology at Austin. And prior to that, he has done other things. In fact, he started out as a graduated from Tech in 1972. And cosmology, some of us probably know very well the predecessor model. Cosmology. So that was his first contribution to science as a PhD. He then went on to become assistant professor at Princeton and became, I think, the youngest tenured Harvard professor at that time, in 1976, professor of astronomy and physics. He continued to work in astronomy and physics for the next 20 years. Among other things, he was the advisor to Adam Hayes, who then later went on to receive the Nobel Prize for his direct research years. In his spare time or something like that, he also led the rescue project. We got the fathers. I didn't feel actually it's people on that effort. And so this book, I think, is like 400,000 and that copies. It's really survival of numerical methods. So then at some point he decided, well, to move on. He went to Los Alamos to become the deputy director for science and technology. So he stayed there for a couple of years and then decided to again move on and went to Texas Austin to become professor of the science and biology. He is a member of the National Academy of Science since '94. He's a member of so many various committees and committees that I can't quite call them all out. For example, he was the director, he was president of the American Association for Advancing Science in the past year. He was a member of the National Research Council for the science and math part. He But let me, before I mention about the talk, first of all, Bill is giving another talk tomorrow. It's in Berkeley Institute for Data Science. That's in the new space of Joe, like Reno plus 90. So there's within 9 years of left. And that's, the talk is at 3 p.m. and the talk is about clinical trials, bandit problems, and computational ethics. So like the talk today, you can check it tomorrow. Now the talk today is not about biology, it's not about computer science, it's not about physical astronomy, it's actually about game theory. So I did another thing and I'm going to show what you can do in your life. Let's see. I will just quote a few words that I just read from MIT's technology of this work that we're going to talk about. The emerging revolution, game theory, monumental surprise, game theory, Trinity on fire, and so on. So keep talking about this.
So is this on? Should I use the microphone? Yeah. Okay, I'll use that. So that's way too kind an introduction. I hope I'll show you that this sort of is about biology because that's kind of how I got interested in it, or why I was trying to be interested in it. Because as a physicist, or at least former member of physics tribe, when you move into another field, you sort of want to ask questions that the people in the field don't think are very important, but with a sort of a physics brain you wonder about. And this is sort of going to be an example of that. And it turned into something, but I don't think a revolution in game theory, but I think what I'll try to show you is never give up on an old problem just because everybody else in the world stopped working on it. So what is this about? Well, at the simplest level, this is about a little two-person game that's played by two people here named X and Y, which conveniently can be denoted as female and male respectively. their chromosomes. See, this is biology. And the way it works is that each player makes one of two choices: to cooperate C or to defect C. I'm sure, I bet 80% of the audience has seen exactly this game before. And if they both cooperate, you know, there's some scenario where they're being questioned by the police and do they inform on each other, but I won't even try to. If they both choose C, then they both get a positive reward of 3. Red, that's Y, gets a reward of 3, and X gets a reward of 3. Okay. But if one of them rats out on the other and defects, then the one who defects gets 5, and here, if X defects, she gets 5. And the one who's been ratted on gets 0, okay? And if they both defect, then they get some small positive. So the key features of this game are that mutual cooperation is pretty good. But each player always does better than defecting. By defecting, if you hold the other player constant, you see that red here would be getting 3, and by defection he can get 5. But what if red plays here? Here he would get 0, and I should say, what if he was forced here by X's play? Here he would get 0, and here he would get 1. So 1 is greater than 0, 5 is greater than 3. Y says, no matter what X does, I should defect. And X does exactly the same calculation, and so they both end up here, non-cooperating. And I think probably I have that. And if you think about this for a minute, you'll find the conditions for the game to end up in that. If instead of numbers 3, 5, 0, and 1 here, you had variables R, T, S, and P, the conditions are that they be ordered this way, and then I'll leave as a puzzle for the reader why there's also this condition that essentially says the average of 5 and 0 should be less than 2R. I'm sorry, the average should be less than 3. So what does this have to do possibly with biology? It's a model for whether organisms in a species should cooperate or not in some set of circumstances where cooperation is good, but defecting is even better. Now, the iterated prisoner's dilemma, IPD, is a popular model for the evolution of this kind of cooperation or lack of cooperation. And the idea of IPD is that X and Y play an in principle infinite sequence of these games over and over again. So they can learn whether they're playing against someone who likes to cooperate, who likes to defect, you know, and maybe they can get a strategy for how to play better than if it was just one time with that one table. The way, okay, and then an interesting point is they don't have infinite memory of the past play. Each of them has only a finite memory of the past play. So I said that, and each evolves a strategy. And a question you can ask is, do they usually achieve cooperation or not if they have this kind of memory? So here I've given an example where Y is playing a memory 7 strategy. That means Y's choice of whether to be in this column or this column is conditioned on the outcomes of the 7 previous games. Some sample of, let me see, I cooperated and she defected 3 times, and I defected and she, you know, that kind of stuff. And in this example, I'm saying X has only a memory 2 strategy. But the question is there a way that they can achieve cooperation? And the answer has been well known for about 30 years or more in this simple game to be no. And I'll give you some examples of this. So this basic thing, IPD, was popularized starting about 30 years ago with work by these luminaries in integrated biology and also in popular book writing, Richard Dawkins, and it's kind of a well-known and kind of fun thing. And there have been contests between people and among computers in trying to devise strategies to win in IPD, in iterated prisoners. Now, when I got interested in this, I actually noticed something, and whether this is new or not, it's actually not new, but But it's interesting because when I noticed this, and I'll tell you what it is in a second, I started asking around, you know, people I knew who knew something about theory, and I said, is this already well known? Is this well known? And half of them said, that's amazing, so it can't be true. And the other half said, oh yeah, this is well known. It's so obvious that no one has ever bothered to write it down. And I'll let you be the judge. And what it is, the idea is that oddly, it's the shortest player, it's the shortest memory player who determines what the strategies will be. And I won't take you through this whole calculation, but let me sort of show you the idea of it. So suppose that x is the random variable that's what x plays. So x has the values c and d. And y is what player y plays. And so the whole game will be characterized by what's the probability of seeing a play x plays x and y plays y, given some history in the game. And I'll divide it into two pieces. The recent history that's known to both x and y, that would be, in my previous slide, 2 plies, or the older history that's known to y alone, the longer memory player. Okay? So you write down that what we're interested in is the expectation, that is to say how often this occurs, averaged over how often those past histories occur. We're interested in the expectation of this. Okay, and then you fiddle around with laws of probability a little bit, and it turns out that the answer depends on y's strategy only through this expression, which marginalizes, that is to say, averages over all the old memory. Okay, and so I can just take what's in the box and just define that because it no longer depends on h1; it only depends on h0, just formally. And therefore, I can call that. Y doesn't think of it as his probability of playing this given h0, but in fact it is his probability of playing that given h0. And therefore, h1, the old history, didn't enter at all. Now, the simplest example of that is if you're playing against a player who's playing randomly with 0 memory, then no strategy does any good. Okay, you know, looking at their past play for the last 1,000 moves doesn't do any good if they have no memory of it and we're just playing randomly. And so this is basically just the extension of that from no memory to finite memory in each case. Okay, so why does this make something fun? It means that if x chooses to play memory 1, then the whole game is memory 1, and we can just analyze the memory 1 game to death, and that will be without loss of generality as long as x, we're thinking of ourselves as x, gets to set the rules by implicitly playing only memory 1. So what does the memory 1 game look like? The memory 1 game looks like x, so that is the blue player, right? I keep forgetting who is who, right? Yeah, X is the blue player. But in any case, the outcome of the previous game is in one of these 4 quadrants, because they either did CC, CD, DC, or okay. And each player gets to choose a probability with which, if they're red, they should do this versus this. And if they're blue, they should do the other way around. So this, if they're red, it's they get to choose. I'm getting confused on which was rows and which was columns. You see what I mean? One of them gets to choose which column they're in, and the other gets to choose which row they're in. And so each one simply has 4 probabilities, which are the probability of choosing that conditioned on the outcome of the previous game. So where am I trying to get to? And this is the title of the talk. The instantaneous strategy of the whole game is a point in this 8 cube, in this 8-dimensional cube, because that's just 8 numbers, each between 0 and 1. Now, I could test whether you're all awake by saying, is it really 8 numbers, or is there some constraint that they have to add up to 1 or something? No, I won't make you do that quiz. It's really 8 numbers because these are completely unrelated probabilities. Each one applies only for one outcome of the previous game. don't add up. So once you realize that the memory 1 game is just a point in this 8 cube, then you also realize that you get from the previous move to this move, and it's a Markov process. And if you have no idea what a Markov process is, you can stop listening for a couple minutes, but if you know, it should be obvious that basically we have these probabilities, and from starting in one of these 4 quadrants, 1, 2, 3, 4, we have a probability on the next move of being in one of these 4 quadrants, 1, 2, 3, 4, with this table of obvious probabilities. So now we don't actually simulate the plays of the game. We don't have to. I mean, I thought when I was getting interested in this, okay, I'll have to write a really efficient little piece of intercomputer code to be able to play, 100 million plays or something for each point in here. But no, once we know that this is a Markov process, we can predict the outcome of the game for any point in this strategy space just by doing some algebra on this matrix. I'll come back to that. That's where one of my heroes, Freeman Dyson, comes into this story in an interesting way. But we still have to explore kind of by hand this whole 8-dimensional strategy space to see if there's anything interesting going on there. So let's write a little computer program that just, and this is again to model biological evolution, that just climbs the gradient. Each player will start at some strategy in that cube, and then each player will adjust their degrees of freedom a little bit at a time up the gradient to try to maximize their score. And of course, they're competing against each other. But let's see what happens. So we'll start fully non-cooperative, and we'll alternate moves, and each player gets to sample only a little 4-dimensional neighborhood, the 4 probabilities that they control, and move uphill. Now, you might not think so, but it's going to turn out to matter a lot what each player does if they're in a position that is exactly neutral. In other words, the gradient is exactly 0. And you might think that's a set of measure 0, but I'll come back to that. It's actually not. It's actually important in the game, it turns out. And the question I was just sort of idly interested in, and this really was idly, I guess I have another slide where I'll tell you how idle I was when I got interested in this. Is, are there any Nash equilibria of this evolution? In other words, are there any points in the interior of that cube where whatever the strategy is, it's no longer advantageous for either the red player or the blue player to change their strategy? And you'd think that's just such a basic thing that it would have been known 30 years ago. But it's not hard to go look at the literature, and no, nobody sort of thought that way about this. So here's an example of the simulation. The players start off non-cooperative. Nothing happens for 1,000 plays of the 1,000 little evolutionary moves. Each move is, in principle, an infinite number of plays. And then all of a sudden we go into these wild oscillations. So remember, 1 is the non-cooperative score, 3 is the cooperative score, and 5 is the score you can get by defecting if your opponent doesn't. And you get this wild evolution, and then look here, we achieve cooperation for a little while, and then it completely breaks down. And this is just a wonderful little chaotic system. You know, if you like little toy chaotic systems that you can evolve, this is a great one. Okay. And remember, I had to specify what move each player would make if the gradient were exactly 0. And just as a dumb, hack in the computer code, I just put in a very small constant gradient for each player that would bias them in a certain direction if the calculated gradient was so small, was less than that. So I put in a bias of 10 to the minus 6. And here's one evolution with one random choice of bias. Here's another one with another random choice of bias. Okay, here's a third one, right? And here's one. These are not 4 consecutive ones. I had to, by eye, look at a few hundred ones before I found one where they don't cooperate, they don't cooperate, they don't cooperate, they start cooperating, they defect a little bit, and now they cooperate on. Okay, so hooray for cooperation. However, I have to tell you that if I continue running this, it'll eventually, it really is a chaotic system, it'll eventually break down and just wild oscillation. So cooperation in this game does not seem to be stable by just sort of anecdotally running simulations of it. So now I'll tell you how I got slightly more serious. It's because on weekends, my wife always tries to make me go out on a hike with her. This is especially in summers when we're in Los Alamos. And her shortest hike is approximately equal to my longest hike. Those are both about 5 miles, right? And so if I want to avoid this terrible experience of the 5-mile forced march across the plateaus of northern New Mexico, I have to come up with something that I really, really have to do. So one weekend, I decided that what I really, really had to do was try to, in a fairly sophisticated way, find out whether there were Nash equilibria for the prisoners of the pub. I'm so sorry, sweetheart, I won't be able to go on the hike with you today. So that is, I just want to normalize how serious I am about this problem. But it's actually, so now we're a little bit in numerical recipes land. It's actually kind of an interesting problem because it's kind of a weird minimax thing. It's that you have 2 sets of variables, and P is trying to adjust P to adjust some score function, and Q is trying to adjust Q to adjust some score function. And where do they both end up at an equilibrium? So you basically have a condition over these score functions, which are big polynomials that you can write down from the Markov thing, that 8 derivatives are 0. Okay, but it's not either a maximum or a minimum, and it's not even quite a minimax. So because you have 8 equations and 8 unknowns, the solutions should generically be isolated points. So you might well find a nice point that is the Nash equilibrium of this problem. And the fun part is to, figure out for numerical jocks around, quasi-Newton methods, saddle points. Okay, so fun stuff, and I didn't have to go on the hike, and I tried to do this. As far as I know, the literature on this numerical problem is about 3 papers 20 years ago, and nobody is very interested in it. Well, my program kept crashing with divide by 0 conditions, and not bugs in the code. It would just evolve to a divide by 0 somehow, and then crash. Why is that? Well, it's great to be able to ask Freeman Deicing questions, okay, and I was able to do that. So my contribution at this stage was I did notice that the program crashes were not random places in this hypercube, but they were all exactly on a 4-dimensional hyperplane. How do you notice? How do you look at 8 dimensions to notice that? Well, you take 4 consecutive crash points and compute the determinant of them in 4 space, and the determinant comes out 0, and the coplane. You sort of have to think about how to diagnose these things. Okay. I asked Freeman, why is it that my program crashes on exactly a hyperplane of dimension 4 in an 8-dimensional space? And of course, Freeman doesn't normally answer programming bug questions, but I got him interested. I told him what this was about. And maybe a day later, I actually got an email from Freeman. He said, oh, this is completely obvious. And it's one of these things where it only involves high school algebra. And so when someone tells you it and you go back and work it out, it really is obvious. But I would never. And this goes back to, I'm not going to work it out for you, but how do you find the stationary vectors of a little 4x4 Markov process? And the answer is, in real life, you do it by solving some linear equations. But as they probably don't even still teach in high school, you can write the solution of linear equations as the determinant of something over the determinant of something, right? And it turns out that for any vector, let's see what is at stake here, any vector f you can write its dot product with the stationary vector of this game as this determinant, which if I do a little bit of algebra and plug in from that Markov thing, becomes this little determinant. So you see how this is a dot product that's linear in F. Sure enough, this determinant is linear in F because it's just in one column. But what's interesting are the way the P's and Q's line up here. And the way the P's and Q's line up here is that there's a column with only P's in it. So this column is under the control of one player. And this column is under the control of the other player. And I think I have an example here. So for example, X's score can be written in this form, but then we have to normalize it. Oh, look, we're doing something down here that's going to have a determinant in the denominator. And that's where all the divide by zeros come. And what was happening was that it basically was evolved. It always wanted to evolve to a degenerate condition, and it's degenerate because the score didn't depend on either P or Q. Okay, I'll be a little more explicit about that in a minute. So this is just sort of a simple piece of high school algebra. I know I've sort of gone zing zing, and you may not fully understand, fully have been doing the algebra. But this suggested, I think, both to Freeman and me, a whole bunch of different strategies that we now know how to compute analytically. So this I will go through a little bit. Okay, and the key idea is the winning player. So, for that brief moment of time, Freeman and I were the only people in the entire known universe who were winning players in this game by our definition. The winning player can enforce a linear relationship between the two players' scores. And let me show you what I mean by that. Here, let's write down what score is X going to get. And that, from Freeman's nice determinant, is this thing, which is these two four-by-four determinants. Okay. Now, just for fun, okay, now, instead of putting Sx here and Sx here, it's linear. The determinant is linear on each slot. So I can put any linear combination of things I want to do here. In other words, I could write this equation for X, and I could write this equation for Y, and I could write this equation for the identity, and putting those together with arbitrary constant alpha, beta, gamma, I would get as an identity that this player's score is this determinant. Okay. But now the trick is that having written this down, and this is just a formal statement of math, player P gets to choose what they put in this slot. And player P can choose to put in this slot a strategy, which is a 4-vector, remember strategy is 4 numbers, a column in this determinant, which is exactly what went into this slot. And now, wham bam, 2 columns in a determinant are identical, and therefore the determinant is 0. And therefore, this combination of scores between X and Y is inevitably forced by X playing this strategy. So this is sort of weird. This is not something that game theorists are used to. The fact that there is a degeneracy where one player somehow takes on a magical power against the other player that isn't sort of what you expect in the game. But it was lurking in this game all along. Now, you have to check some things. You have to check that when you do this, only certain linear combinations give values of P between 0 and 1. All works out. But amazingly, it kind of all works out in one of those nice ways where mathematical ideas most of the time just sort of fall apart at some point, but every once in a while they just sort of work out. So let me give you an example. Oh, and I should say we call these zero determinant strategies. So imagine now what X can do, knowing this, playing against poor dumb Y who doesn't know this. And now I want to make contact back to evolution theory. Okay. So X can exactly set Y's score. Now, she may not get a very good score herself, but Y doesn't care what her score is. Y only cares about his score. So by adjusting Y's score differentially, sometimes larger, sometimes smaller, X can spoof a fitness landscape for Y. Because remember what Y is trying to do? Y is trying to evolve his strategy to find out how to maximize his score. So X can spoof that gradient and lead Y to anywhere she wants. For example, to full cooperation, if she wants. And at full cooperation, she'll be doing pretty well also. Okay? So you can spoof evolutionary landscapes in this game. Or, and this was the one that attracted a lot of attention, X can choose a fixed strategy that is extortionate. And by that I mean, remember that 1 is the baseline score. You get 1 when you both defect. So what's interesting is how much above 1 are you. Okay. So X can be above 1 by an amount that is chi times the amount that Y is above 1. So let's set chi to 5. That says that if Y gets 1.1, then X gets 1.5. Or if Y gets 2, then X gets 5 plus 1 is 6, which is actually impossible because 5 is the max. That would have driven one of the P's out of the possible range. Okay. And this is like set and forget. It's not like X has to sit there watching what Y does and do anything. Okay. I'll show you an example of a strategy. Here is a strategy that has an extortion factor 3. And these are just probabilities associated with if the previous move ended up in the first quadrant, then I cooperate with probability 11/13. If it ended up in the second quadrant, then I end up with probability half. So X just programs this fixed strategy into her play and then goes off and has lunch. And she's guaranteed that she'll do 3 times better than Y, no matter what Y does. Okay, so that sort of seemed a little surprising. And we asked around, yeah, is this well known? No, that can't be right. You know, okay, now you might say, what if they're both winning? What if X and Y both try to have extortion factors? Then see this equation. See what happens? They both get scores 1 because 0 is equal to 3 times 0 either way around that they do it. Okay. So extortion only works against someone who doesn't know that there exists an extortion strategy, which is kind of weird. Okay, and if they are both winning, then there's still some interesting stuff here because it's what the game theorists call an ultimatum game. An ultimatum game is where one player says, either you cooperate in exactly this way, or we both lose, you know, or I explode my bomb, and we both lose. So here's an example of leveraging on that to make an enforceable cooperation treaty. Okay, and the treaty says we will each set the other score at its maximum value. That's 3. Example. If either detects any deviation from this, then the other will reduce their score just for long enough to punish them the amount that they were trying to selfishly get over the same period of time after we will return to the maximum value. Okay, and if you and I execute this treaty and start playing the IPD game, it really is advantageous for both of us to honor the terms of the treaty. And we can only do that knowing how to use ZD. And this is not just conventional prisoner's dilemma, right? This is not just, well, I'm really nice and you're really nice, so why don't we cooperate? Because as we saw in regular prisoner's dilemma, that actually doesn't work. It's always a gradient that you should both defect. Whereas here, with this treaty, you should both continue to cooperate. Okay, this really works. I mean, here are some simulations with extortion factor 5, and these differ just by these choices of these tiny little gradients on what each player plays in the neutral case. So these are, again, evolutions of the strategy. They're not the results of any single game. Any single game would be that. Okay, so can Y escape the extortion? And this is not biology, but Freeman and I both enjoyed this. There's something that psychologists study called theory of mind. That's a sort of a very highfalutin term. Theory of mind is this question: are you capable of perceiving that I'm a rational creature? Do you have a theory about my mind? Okay. So if X is extorting from Y, if Y has a theory of mind about X, then Y's best strategy is to not cooperate and just say, I won't play ball on this until X stops extorting. But if Y doesn't have a theory of mind, then Y just tries to increase his own score, and sure enough, he ends up, a little bit above 1, and he doesn't know anything about it. Why is it that X happens to have that way? In other words, Y can improve himself by evolving. It's just that X is going to get more. Whereas the better thing for Y to do is to not cooperate and then negotiate. So Freeman and I wrote a paper about this and outlined this stuff, and I'll tell you a little bit why it might actually be interesting biology. But it turns out that people are really emotional about this game. Who knew that? So Urosh had one quote, but I'll show you some quotes that came out immediately after the paper. So we showed that cleverness and unfairness triumph after all. And this is a well-known popular writer who wrote a whole book on prisoners of the language. Popular. Okay, so change the game is somebody who couldn't resist a pun. Okay, and then a similar, I will try to do that one. Okay, once again, physicists invade a field and add value. appreciate that one. I'm not sure it's true, but it feels good. Okay. And then we get to the ponderous one. As the agricultural revolution and population growth led to the ability to monopolize social resources, did human cooperation turn from fairness to enforcing the sort of unfair game that President Deicing outlined? Which my answer is, I don't think so. And then this was Urosh had this book, The World of Game Theory is Currently on Fire. I don't think so. I think aside from the sort of popular followers who care about this game, I think there are maybe 20 game theorists in the world who care about this game. But this one, I like. This and similar quant nonsense is precisely what led to the too big to fail banking disaster we are currently confronting. These studies are worse than useless. They are parasitic to cancer. So I hold out to all of you physicists that you should aspire to write a paper that attracts a comment that tells you that you're a parasitic cancer. Especially when it's not. Okay, so let's briefly return to reality. Because here's what I'm a physicist trying to think about biology, and I'll never be able to really think the way biologists who have spent 20,000 hours thinking about biology think about it. But evolution occurs on some fitness landscape. And if you ever look at a popular article and they draw a fitness landscape, they just draw some sort of mountainous, bumpy thing. Here, this is probably bumpier than they ever draw. But in this game, at least, the fitness landscape doesn't look like this so much as like that. And it's not that there are internal peaks in here, because in fact, remember, I failed to find any Nash equilibria in there. I failed to find anything that was a local peak for each player. I think that's still an open question. I don't think it's terribly an interesting question, but I don't think anybody actually knows, are there internal Nash equilibria? Well, I think the answer is probably no. And the way those games, those games I showed you with all the funny oscillations, I'll come back and show you a few more. The way they evolve in this space is actually nothing like finding a mountain peak in a landscape like this. They evolve by having a gradient that goes from wherever you start all the way to a lower dimensional edge, or side, or face, okay? But we're in 8 dimensions, so when you start in 8 dimensions, there are 7-dimensional faces, and then you can go 1 more dimension to generate 6, 5, 4, 3, like a whole set of dimensions of boundaries. So if I go back to these kinds of evolutions of my little evolutionary model, I can plot where at each point we are. Are we in the interior, which would be 8 dimensions? Or are we on a face, which would be 7 dimensions? Or are we on a face, which would be 6 dimensions, and so on, okay? And this is a little bit noisy because I'm doing little finite differences, so I'm never exactly on the face, but I'm close to it. But you can see that really this evolution occurs in these steps, always on edges and boundaries, sometimes jumping out into a higher dimension and sometimes being driven back by the gradient to a lower dimension, okay? And that sort of starts answering the question, what was happening here for 5,000 evolutionary steps when nothing was going on? And the answer was, a lot was actually going on. The strategies were evolving by landing on a face and moving around that face and landing on a smaller face, but this is this high polynomial. The high polynomial, you know, had not exactly zeros, but was just exactly degenerate. Some factorization, some had zeros, exactly degenerate on those faces. And so these scores didn't change one bit. Okay. So the action in this evolutionary landscape is not in the interior, it's on the faces. And the other thing is, and this is like lots of chaotic systems, this is a graph where I'm trying to show how singular that determinant was, the one that was always going to 0 when I was doing it the first time around. And it's a log scale, and these are sort of powers of 10 where the scale is. So what you see is these sharp transitions occur when I approach a place where the denominator goes to 0, and it's like scattering off of a singular point. You sort of scatter off into kind of a random direction in some higher dimension than you were in, out of the 8, and go on to that. So that's, in a sense, that's the source of the chaos. The chaos is gradient motion. I go to a boundary, I go to the boundary of the boundary, I go to the boundary of the boundary, and then maybe on the next step, I go to the boundary of that, but it's a singular point. Wham, I get thrown back out into some higher dimension. Okay, generally not all the way up to 8. Okay, so that's going to be fun. And in the interior of the cube, everything is smooth. So it's nothing like an evolutionary landscape at all, and yet you have all this interesting kinds of evolution. Okay, so it turns out, you know, you may be mystified that there should be all of these neutral boundaries, and that's just a property of this problem. But it's kind of fun. There are 6,560 lower dimensional boundaries on an 8 cube. Does anybody know where that number comes from? I'm actually giving it away here when I list them. No? Okay. Well, I'll tell you, this is one of those things. You should learn this once in your life. In each of the 8 dimensions, we can either be on the left boundary, 0, on the right boundary, 1, or somewhere in the middle, call it x. So 3 to the 8 is 6561. Minus 1 because we want to know how many boundaries, not the interior. The interior would be x, 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 x. So that's just the labeling scheme for edges. And you can sort of easily find all of the edges in different dimensions that are exactly neutral for either x or y or both, and all of those that are singular. And as I say, the evolution is really a trade-off between slow evolution along neutrals followed by scattering off of one of these singulars. I don't expect you to be able to use that fact in life. What is interesting is that real biologists, or I should say real evolution theorists, have long thought about these problems, and this is something called cryptic genetic variation. And this is the fact that because of the way DNA regulatory networks work, you can have a network that's doing its thing, but the last step has mutated away, and so it's not really doing anything. Okay? It's like the rudder is no longer connected to, the wheel is no longer connected to the rudder on that particular network. So you can have a functional network, and then due to a mutation, it falls out of functionality. But it keeps evolving just randomly. Okay? And that's this cryptic diversity in the population. And then if the mutation that made it fall out makes it become visible again, suddenly what it appears is that evolution has jumped a finite distance from one whole regulatory network to another whole regulatory network. But what's really happening was it just evolved there by neutral evolution, okay? But there was no phenotype during that evolution because it was blocked somehow. So what I sort of took away as, I don't think this is an exactly applicable lesson about biology, but I think this is sort of a way to think about a lot of these problems, is that we shouldn't probably draw fitness landscapes like this. We should draw it like this, because, as I say, in real biological networks, up-down binary regulation is really a very common thing. You can turn on this connection or turn off this connection, okay? And it's easy to imagine the real biological analog of these pinned boundaries, you know, where you, if an enzyme is completely turned off, if you're not producing an enzyme, that's really a boundary. You can't produce a negative amount of it, okay? If you're producing the maximum amount, given some conditions, okay? So I think this picture might be the right way to think about evolution, because the alternative of how do we explore a high floating point, I'm writing here, a high continuous space, that's actually very hard to arrange with the machinery that real life has, namely sort of digital logic in DNA, followed by, well, we have rate equations and we have reactions, but generally they're, you know, either saturated to some maximum value or zero, not really generally finely tuned to use the floating point. Okay, so I can wind up this story by telling you that after we did this work and our paper came out, it turns out there was a lot of life left in Prisoner's Dilemma again. There was a very interesting paper by a guy named Aiken, who's a mathematician at, I forget, NYU. Should know, but I forget, sorry. And then Stewart and Plotkin, who were one of the people who made it, had a nice quote to tell about us. And this is a picture that I took from Stewart and Plotkin in a very recent paper. And it turns out, so we pointed out that there was this special algebraic structure in the game, the ZD strategies. And there are particular ZD strategies. Tit for tat was a well-known strategy all along in Prisoner's Dilemma game. And tit for tat is one extreme of these extortion strategies. What Aiken showed is that there's another completely different little cute algebraic structure in this game that he calls good strategies. And good strategies are basically strategies that automatically create for the other opponent a cooperative Nash equilibrium. So except it's not exactly one of those point Nash equilibriums. Okay, so I'm not but they're good because in iterated Prisoner's Dilemma, they always lead to cooperation. Now, what Stewart and Plotkin found were they found this little wedge. There's a wedge of strategies which are zero determinant strategies, but they're also good strategies. And I'll tell you what they're like. They're basically our extortion strategy, but where you extort not a number greater than 1, but you extort a number slightly less than 1. Okay? And remember, we were accused by the blogosphere of proving that extortion always wins. Well, that was actually our own blindness, because we never thought to try setting the extortion factor to less than 1. But if you set the extortion factor to like 0.9, what does that mean? You've I'm the winning player. I set Y's score to have this property that I'm going to extort 0.9. That says Y tries to evolve to increase his score. And my score goes up too, but I only take 0.9 as much reward as Y gets. Okay? And then the way it works out is as we approach the mutual cooperative value, we both converge on the mutual cooperative value. Okay? And those turn out to all be stable evolutions. So if I showed you evolutions of my little toy model for generous extortion, okay, they would both end up at fully cooperative. So that's kind of fun. And then what Aiken showed is there are generous strategies that are good strategies that are basically this whole thing. I guess I said that. But then I just want to tell you another interesting wrinkle when you try to make real biology out of this, or at least real evolution out of this. And it's, we're always thinking about the same two players playing each other. That's not the same question as whether a strategy will win in a population, will take over a population. Okay. And you might say, why isn't it? Suppose I'm playing extortion and I'm thrown into a population. Well, first I play him and I extort him and win, her, and win. Okay, but what happens here when I play someone who's playing my same strategy because they're actually my great-great-great-great-grandcell? Okay, so for a strategy to take over the population, it also has to have benign behavior when it's playing itself. Or otherwise, it can only come up to a certain concentration, and then it's hurting itself as often as it's helping itself, and it doesn't grow anymore. So it turns out that within each of these categories, there are these little darker things, which are, no, I'm sorry, I said it wrong. It's just within this, there are evolutionarily robust strategies, which actually will take over a population successfully. Everybody will and that, of course, is much more interesting biologically, because that's what happens in real life when you have a phenotype that takes over a whole population. It takes over a whole population. It has to be good for everybody. Okay, and that's actually, I think, the end of my little fable for today. So thank you very much. Okay, so if the way if one player is fully cooperative, then the other player always wins by being fully defecting. Okay, so that's a great strategy for the fully defecting one, but the fully cooperating one will quickly evolve away from full cooperation because anything's better.
I think he's asking, so if you have an extortion strategy with extortion factor less than 1, say that leads to the evolution of cooperation occurred because the goal is both cooperating all the time.
Yeah.
And he's saying if in the limit they are both cooperating all the time, they're getting the same return.
Yeah. It's because there was one equation that I should have had my slides and didn't have, and it's when you set the extortion factor at less than 1, you actually, remember I had an equation that has score minus 1. The way you do the generous strategies is you do 3 minus score, so that you converge to both cooperate. So it's still a linear combination. It's not exactly that. Yeah.
The last slide you want to use tables.
Yeah. So as I said, there's sort of 30 years of people fooling around with this problem in kind of semi-anecdotal ways, and just imagining strategies and playing. And one, win state, lose shape. That says, I start by cooperating. I'm going to tell the strategy from my perspective. I cooperate. If I win on that round, and that would be because you also cooperated, then I stick to that strategy and I cooperate the next time. If I fail, then I switch my strategy the next time. Okay? And it's a surprisingly effective strategy. But it turns out our extortionate strategies easily win against it because you see we're in the ZD extortion thing, and they're not in the ZD, so there are a whole bunch of strategies with creative names associated with them. And I think what the papers, ours, and then more interestingly, these papers that came after ours, have sort of, instead of just thinking of a strategy and giving it a name, have actually looked at the algebraic structure of the game and found names. Okay.
So, Bill, I assume that the prisoner's dilemma, the prisoner's dilemma, are this subset of stuff much larger than
Yeah, yeah.
And then we're wondering, are these other types of games also analyzed for solution? Or is this one really completely dilemma to qualify?
Well, this is, this is like in physics considered a spherical graph. And the prisoner's dilemma is the unique model if you're interested in the evolution of cooperation. There are plenty of other games that don't have any counterintuitive outcomes about them. There's just sort of a clear, there's a clear Nash equilibrium for each player, and if you contrive some evolutionary scenario, the players would just evolve to that, and there wouldn't be anything hard to understand. So what makes it prisoner's dilemma are those inequalities that I showed you. Sure, there's any manner of 2x2 games for it.
So also sort of generalizing this was all for the memory one.
Yeah.
Do you have anything to say about the prisoner's dilemma with with longer memories?
No, other than you may have a longer memory, but if I just play memory one, I'm guaranteed these results. You can't defeat these results by playing them longer. Okay, that was that first messy slide I showed that had the marginalization thing in. So in a certain sense, if one of these strategies is good enough for me, I'm forcing you into being good enough for you, forcing you to this space.
But could it be possible like memory two strategy is better? Or?
Well, you have to define better in what way? Nothing can be better than full cooperation because that's just scores on the table of the game. So if there's a generous, if in one of these evolutionarily robust, generous zero in the purple thing, it's hard to imagine that anything is better unless you have some metric under which full cooperation isn't what you need. Waiting back.
But is there a possibility that if both sides try a longer memory strategy, that they could have a possible set of strategies that would lead to converging to full cooperation-ish?
Okay. So if they converge to full cooperation, then they just both, in the example I'm using, get 3, and we already now know how to do that. But let me reinterpret your question. Maybe this is what you meant. Is there some clever way that they can play off of those boxes that had 5 and 0 to each, on the average, get better than 3? And that was that mysterious inequality that I showed on the first slide, that the average of 5 and 0 was less than 3. Okay? So the answer to your question is, if the payoffs were 7 and 0, so that the average was 3.5, then yes, I think that longer memory games would be interesting because there might be some strategy under which they could enforce enforce an alternation between getting 7 and 0 in some way so that they would average 3.5 instead of 3. That game happens to not be called Prisoner's Dilemma game. I don't know if it is.
So I know this is your model that not
Well, okay, so I've sort of moved on. I'm not against this, but not exactly this scenario. But there's a whole field of synthetic biology, which is to engineer little mechanisms into microbes that they didn't naturally have. And I haven't tried to sell this idea to a synthetic biology colleague as an experiment, but you could imagine engineering exactly Prisoner's Dilemma game into a little bug. You know, how do you do this? They each secrete something that the other needs, and there's a payoff in that. And I think that's within the realm of synthetic biology engineering now. You know, it's like a fun PhD thesis. What you would learn from that, other than developing new pieces of synthetic biology, I'm not sure, because you would just be testing, could you implement exactly the algebra scheme? But synthetic biology is a really interesting field, because it's at a stage now where people are building up these little modules of ability to do kind of little toy spherical cow things. And at some point, they're going to have enough capability of doing that they'll be able to, make little bugs do fancy things. Yeah.
You mentioned the theory of mind to foil these extortion strategies. So I'm wondering if you can speculate on whether, because humans have theory of mind, whether that's why we've been so successful as a species.
That would be a great thing to talk about over beer, but I'm not going to speculate.
Okay. No more questions? Let's thank you again.